ahead and get started.
How did I manage that? I don't know.
Webinar.
It's called Zoellick time. My wife hates it.
All right, excellent. It looks like we are ready to go live. Well, welcome everyone to the Energy Reliability, Resilience, and Innovation in Humboldt County webinar. So this is the second of two in a webinar series about the grid overall in California, and then tonight we're focusing primarily on the grid and energy issues here in Humboldt County. So my name is Mahayla. I work for Redwood Coast Energy Authority, and we are really happy to share some important information given to you by some excellent experts in their field. So tonight we've got Jana Ganion, who's the Sustainability and Government Affairs Director from Blue Lake Rancheria. We've got John Fortune, who's a Senior Director at Swell Energy. We have Jim Zoellick, Principal Engineer at the Schatz Energy Research Center, and then our very own Richard Engel, who's the Director of Power Resources at RCEA. So you'll hear me talking, and then also my colleague Jocelyn will be doing some more moderating on the Q&A side of things. So on that note, I want to encourage everyone to please submit questions in the Q&A box. So you'll see that there's a Q&A box for questions to the panelists, and then there's also a chat box, which we encourage you to use if you have tech support questions, or you can go ahead and call the number on the screen as well and talk to Nancy and figure things out. But yeah, so please submit questions at any time, and then Jocelyn will jump in with questions as they come up kind of naturally in the flow of conversation. All right. So tonight's discussion, we're going to have a quick overview of the grid and RCEA's role in the larger electric grid by me, so that we're all just kind of starting at the same place. And then we'll have some brief introductions of the panelists, including an introduction of the organizations that they work for. And then we'll also have some time for questions from us, and then questions from the audience. So that's why I'm really encouraging you to ask any burning questions you've had, or questions about things that come up in throughout the evening. All right, so you may have seen that there's a poll that popped up as you arrived here, and I'm going to go ahead and see what we've got for the results of the poll. So it looks like, what is the biggest concern related to electricity? And folks are primarily interested in climate change and greenhouse gas emissions at 86%. And then we've got some interest in cost of utility bills. And I know that it's a little bit of a dirty trick to only allow you to be interested in one thing. And I'm sure you're probably to some degree interested in all of these things. But it's really nice to have a sense of people's focus, and we'll try and spend a little time focusing on the interests that we see here. All right, thanks for participating. Really appreciate that. Okay, so we're gonna jump right into a little overview of RCEA and the grid at large. So Redwood Coast Energy Authority is a community choice aggregator. So we're a local governmental agency, and the aggregator part of that name means that we aggregate the demand, the demand for energy of our customers here in Humboldt County, and then we buy energy on behalf of those customers. We do provide the majority of energy here in Humboldt County. We're a load serving entity, and we contract for power on behalf of our customers. But PG&E still provides the transmission and distribution service for Humboldt County. So that means they still maintain the poles and wires and make sure that the energy that we buy is delivered to the customer. So I wanted to give a visual of the transmission grid in Humboldt County and Northern California a little bit more generally, and kind of get a sense of what it looks like. So we're seeing a lot of lines on this page, and those lines are transmission lines. And somewhat intuitively, the voltage, meaning the capacity, relates to the size of the line and the color of the line. And when we look at the left side, the Humboldt County side, those are some pretty sparse and spindly lines as compared to the Reading area. And this is something that we bring up because it's a visualization of the constraint that Humboldt County is under for moving energy around. So that means essentially that it's hard to get energy into Humboldt County and hard to get it out. And so that certainly has repercussions for the ability to generate energy here and supply it to the rest of the grid, and then also receive energy from other areas when we need it. So I wanted to talk about the grid as a pool of water. So this can be kind of a helpful analogy. So for grid reliability and stability in general, we can think of the grid as a pool of water where we need the level to remain the same all the time. And so we have all of these generators that are producing electricity, or hoses pouring water into the pool. So it's constantly producing energy. And then on the other side of things, we have straws. And these are what we call loads or demand on the grid. And this is you when you're turning your toaster on, when you're putting a load of laundry on, that kind of thing. And so every time someone increases load or adds a new load to the electricity grid, simultaneously we need generation to be increasing. So anytime there's a straw sucking water out, we need a hose to be increasing the water flow on their end instantaneously and at the same rate. So this is a tricky job, and it's performed by the California Independent System Operator. And they perform this supply and demand balance for the majority of California. So continuing to think about this concept that we need to maintain the stability of the grid and the same supply of water, at the same level. We really don't need the straws and the hoses to be located in the same place. It's okay if we have one on one side and one on the other side. And so in the case of Redwood Coast Energy Authority, that means that we have contracts for generation in places outside of Humboldt County. But we're still providing all of the energy needs for our customers here locally. This is also predicated on the idea that there's enough transmission, there's enough capability of moving energy from one place to another to satisfy everyone. So, as a customer, we're buying energy on your behalf, perhaps in Southern California or something like that. But the electrons that you're using, which are essentially indistinguishable from each other, could be coming from the PG&E power plant, or it could be coming from your neighbor's net energy metering system, their solar array on the house next door. And as we transition to a more renewable grid, there are a lot of challenges stemming from the fact that a portion of the water in our pool is coming from hoses that can't be turned off and on at will, and they fluctuate with nature. And so, of course, when we think about that, we think about solar and we think about wind. So here is a graph from the California Independent System Operator that we were just talking about of electricity demand in the state of California on kind of a typical spring day. So as we can see from the kind of, let's say, turquoisey line here, customers are using energy throughout the day. It's, you know, a little bit wavy, but fairly steady throughout the early portion of the day. But then when we get to the evening, 5:17, we're starting to see this increase as people come home and, you know, they turn on their stoves and whatnot. They want to do all the activities that go with life. And so we see a bit of a natural bump there. And then when we look at this kind of more purplish blue line, this is net demand. So it's the total demand of all customers minus the fluctuating renewable energy generation. So that's minus wind and solar. So at first we're seeing that it tracks pretty well with general demand, but then once the sun rises and there's a significant amount of solar on the electricity grid, then we see this huge dip in net demand, which is fantastic. You know, we're offsetting a significant amount of demand through renewable energy. However, when we get over to that evening period, once again, not only are we seeing the increased demand from people coming home and turning on their rice cookers, we're also seeing that, of course, the sun's going down, and there's this big gap in between the amount of energy that people want and the amount of energy that's provided by the renewable energy sources. And so these other sources of energy are having to make up for that gap. So that's a large challenge that we, as an industry, are having to face. And this is kind of infamously known as the duck curve. It's looking less ducky all the time, but if you squint your eyes, you can see it. So this really shows, it illustrates how we can't just rely on solar to get us to a renewable energy grid. And we have to be creative. We have to have a balanced portfolio of generation and storage resources to transition to a fully renewable grid. So that's just a quick run through on some of the renewable energy and grid issues that come up pretty often. And so now I'm going to move over to our panelist presentations. So Richard, you are up first.
Right. Thank you, Mahayla. It's a pleasure to be here talking with everybody this evening. And I wanted to start off the panelist presentations. Again, I'm Richard Engel. I'm Director of Power Resources at Redwood Coast Energy Authority. So I work with Mahayla and Jocelyn and a couple other team members that kind of make up the group that runs our community choice aggregation program from day to day at RCEA. And to kick things off tonight, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of how RCEA works on getting Humboldt County to a cleaner power mix. So if you can just give me the first click here. And I'm going to kind of frame this as the 4 Ps being a planning process at the front end of it, and then procurement, by which I mean energy that we get just by basically signing contracts and paying somebody else to take care of the details of delivering that power. And then alternatively, another pathway, projects, by which I mean getting power through ways where RCEA has more hands-on involvement in the process, and we'll talk about some examples of that. Together, the procurement and the projects lead to our power portfolio. So just going through each of those a bit, let's start with the planning, and kind of upstream of the planning items that I'll put up here on the screen. I'll just mention there's sort of a regulatory background to all this, namely, most significantly, the California Public Utilities Commission and their implementation of two pieces of legislation, one of those being SB 100, Bill 100, which sets kind of the pace at which load serving entities like RCEA need to add renewable energy to our portfolio. And then Senate Bill 350, which dictates a minimum percentage of that power that needs to be under long-term contracts in order to incentivize development of new resources on the grid. So what we've got up here on the screen is kind of when you pivot to, okay, what's RCEA's own planning process? Well, you may remember, because we did a lot of public process around this in 2019, we did an update of our organization's strategic plan. We called that Repower Humboldt. We held a number of public workshops and culminated in our board adopting that plan in December 2019. That kind of qualitatively set our goals. On a more quantitative level, just this past September, we delivered to the Public Utilities Commission our integrated resource plan. And this really lays out in detail, and you can visit our website and look at our integrated resource plan narrative and spreadsheets to see in detail the procurement we intend to do over the next 10-year time horizon. And we'll be updating that every 2 years per PUC requirements. On the procurement side, what we were doing initially when we launched our program and continue to do to some extent is short-term purchases. So just getting for months or maybe a year at a time, wind energy, solar power, and then quite a bit of carbon-free power, which mostly means large-scale hydropower that doesn't qualify as renewable. And then that's balanced with long-term contracts, which and our plan over time is to phase out more and more of the short-term purchases and increasingly replace that with long-term contracts that give us better predictability and stability of price. So even before we launched our CCA program, we already had one biomass contract in place for local power. We've since then executed contracts for additional biomass, for solar, for power storage, for small hydro that's renewable, for demand response, and we're currently working towards getting a couple of contracts in place for distributed energy resources. And John's company, Swell, is one of the companies that we're currently in discussions with to set that up. Over on the project side, the Redwood Coast Airport microgrid, which most of you are probably at least somewhat familiar with, is kind of a flagship project for us, and it's unique in that this is a project where RCEA will actually own and operate the generating assets. That's not normally part of our business model. Offshore wind, I'm sure you've also been hearing about this. And when time comes to actually generate the power, we'll probably shift into more of a procurement mode where we'll just be entering a contract to buy that power from the consortium of companies that will be generating it. But for the time being, we're actively involved in a public-private partnership to help facilitate offshore wind being developed in the best way possible for outcomes for Humboldt County. Something we're really starting to dive into now that was identified in our strategic plan update is small run-of-the-river hydropower. So we have a consultant that we're working with who's looking at the possibility of developing low environmental impact hydro projects on rivers and streams in Humboldt County and surrounding counties that could add to our portfolio and be done, we call it hydro done right, that won't impact anadromous fish or other sensitive resources. And biomass, we've heard plenty from the community, people who both support and have concerns about biomass power being in our portfolio. And the concerns, when we hear them, generally revolve around emissions from these sort of legacy biomass plants that date back several decades. There is a next generation biomass technology out there. And so we're looking at ways that we might be able to transition, because we do have basically a waste stream from the local forest products industry. And we're looking for ways that we continue to derive energy from biomass, but do it in ways that are lower environmental impact. So the culmination of all this is coming to a portfolio, and that's a tiny version of it. So we can click to the next slide and see a legible size version. A lot of solar in our 2030 target supply mix for our integrated resource plan. That's largely due to one big contract that we've already entered into, and we also have a feed-in tariff, which is leading to several smaller contracts for local solar. The aforementioned offshore wind, we expect to be a significant chunk of our portfolio 10 years from now. Small hydro, some of it we already have under contract, and some we hope to see developed over this coming decade. We expect to continue to have biomass in some form in our portfolio. And then these other slices are behind the meter things. These are customer owned resources. So energy efficiency and then new and existing solar on the customer side of the meter. So in a nutshell, that's our plan for clean power in the decade to come. And with that, I will hand it back to Mahayla. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. All right, excellent. And now we're going to move over to John.
Hi, folks. Thanks. Yeah, I try to keep mine brief here. So if you want to jump to the next slide, you can see that's me in the blue highlights, and I oversee the grid services market development for Swell Energy. And Swell's been in business for a number of years, but more recently been very focused on developing what we call virtual power plants with utilities. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means in a minute. But to date, we've been commissioned by utilities to develop 6 different virtual power plants or aggregations of systems across 3 different states, totaling more than 14,000 end-use customers. And in this case, end-use customers are homes and businesses. Next slide. So Swell Energy is an energy and smart grid solutions provider, and we unite property owners, industry partners, and utilities behind a shared goal of achieving a reliable, cost-effective, clean, and flexible energy system. And in order to serve those needs, we collaborate with different stakeholder groups to provide simple solar and solar plus energy storage solutions or distributed energy resources that Richard identified, and leading grid service programs. And what we mean by grid service programs is in collaboration with utilities through one of the procurement mechanisms that Richard described. We design and develop, implement, install, operate a collection of systems installed within a utility service territory. And that is, in essence, what a virtual power plant. It's a lot of little systems installed locally within a particular service territory that are bundled up in the cloud using the internet and operated as a giant virtual power plant to support the capacity and the energy needs identified by utilities to help lower the cost of operating the grid and make the grid more reliable for their customers. Okay, and just as a shameless plug, although yeah, you can go to the next slide. Although you know, not so shameless since most of the folks here are RCEA. That we've recently launched a new program that we're under negotiation with RCEA for related to procurement of some capacity resources. And near term, in order to make sure that we can support folks applying for and reserving self-generation incentive program incentives for equity and resiliency, folks who are fit a certain qualification standard that have been affected by the power supply shutoffs, that we're trying to help folks reserve those incentives while they're available, and we're going to ultimately enroll customers once the program has been negotiated and give them the option to earn some additional rewards by participating in RCEA's new Protect Your Power virtual power plant program. And so I added a link here if folks on this webinar are curious if they're eligible or want to explore the program a little bit more. That is the landing page for that website. Okay, next slide. And one of the motivations here for also raising this and why we have sort of pre-launched the program before we've completed the negotiations of the procurement is that the money available for these incentives is super beneficial to supporting the adoption of energy storage for home backup. And there's been a recent ruling that changed the way that customers who are eligible for a particular, the highest incentive, the equity resiliency incentive, and the result of that change in those rules is that it appears that there's going to be between $20 and $60 million of additional budget that's going to be returned to the equity resiliency budget, which right now has entered into a waitlist status, which means that the reservations had been all but entirely reserved. So that's good news for us, and so that I'm kind of pushing this call to action here. Please, make sure you communicate out to folks if they have an interest in evaluating their eligibility for the equity resiliency to get in contact with us sooner than later, and that's residential and small commercial. Next slide. And this is just a real brief overview of what that type of offering looks like with consumers. So when you contact us, there's some customer information that we collect from you in order to steer us in the direction of figuring out what an appropriate system size is going to be for your site, as well as your eligibility for the self-generation incentive programs. And based on some of those factors, we have several different offer types that we can provide customers with. And at this point in time, what we're really looking at is either a cash purchase or a finance system in terms of the ownership model, along with an energy service agreement, which is similar to a lease and covers many elements of the contract and the operations and management, as well as to include solar as part of the packaged system project. And then in the future, once we have defined the grid services program and offers for the RCEA program, we will be circling back with an optional offer for a grid services agreement in which customers would allow Swell and RCEA to utilize the battery system to reduce the overall cost of operating the grid and therefore benefit the community. And the entirety of the program, really, its underlying goal here is to support the adoption of battery storage to, especially when paired with solar, to help lower local greenhouse gas emissions and better manage against these power supply shutoff situations. So that is the nature of my presentation. Thank you guys for letting me come on here and share that with you.
Excellent. Thank you, John. All right, we're moving over to Jim now.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Lots of good information. So my name's Jim Zoellick. I'm a principal engineer at the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State University. I've been working there for a little over 25 years, and the Schatz Center has been in existence for just over 30 years. Right now, we've got about 40 employees. You can see this picture's a little bit dated at this point, but quite a few of those folks there in the picture are still working with me as colleagues. But for the most part, we're all sheltered in place. Actually, there's a few people at the center, but so this is how I see people these days, just like the rest of you via a Zoom meeting. So we're affiliated with the Environmental Resources Engineering program at Humboldt State. And our mission is to promote the use of clean and renewable energy. And we've partnered on many projects. We've done a lot of work here locally, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment, and in those projects. We've partnered closely with the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, been a wonderful partner and partnering right now with them, as well as Jana, Ganion, and the Blue Lake Rancheria. So next slide, please. So I just want to give you a quick sense. Hopefully many of you participating tonight already know about us, but I'll just give you a brief overview of some of the work that we're involved in. So these are our key research areas right now that the center is involved in. They've changed a bit over the years, but so the top one, off-grid energy access, there's probably about half of our group is involved in off-grid energy access. It's primarily work being done internationally in the developing world in Africa and Asia, focused on access to clean and reliable energy services for people in the developing world, and largely focused on product quality. So developing standards and quality assurance programs. It's funded by the World Bank primarily, and a program called Lighting Global. And then the rest of those categories, so bioenergy, energy planning, transportation, offshore wind, microgrids, pretty much all of those we've focused on local projects. There's also work that we do in statewide and nationally, but really a lot of focus on local projects, and that's my work over the years has often focused on local projects, and I get a lot of satisfaction from doing local projects. I'll talk about the others in a minute, but I don't have anything else on another slide with regards to offshore wind. So I know Richard just mentioned offshore wind. We have been involved, we've been funded by BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So that's a federal agency, as well as the Ocean Protection Council, a state agency, and the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, another state agency or state group. And we've been looking at the opportunities and challenges and potential impacts for developing offshore wind off of the coast of Humboldt County here on the North Coast. And we've just completed over the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks, we just did 5 webinars. So hopefully some of you may have had the opportunity to participate in those webinars. If you're interested in more information, you can go to our website. So you can see it at the bottom there, shotscenter.org. There's a wind page, and all of those 5 webinars, you can there's recordings so you can watch them. There's the slide decks from them, and then there's an array of reports that are mostly available and a couple still to come. So please go there if you have an interest in learning more about offshore wind energy and the possibilities for projects like that here in Humboldt County. Next slide, please. So just a little more focus, and I won't take too long here, but on some of the local projects we've done over the years. And again, you know, these have been, I think, as I look at these in one way or another, in all of these, we've partnered with RCEA and or the Blue Lake Rancheria. So the energy planning work, we've done quite a bit of work with tribes, including the Blue Lake Rancheria, but also the Yurok, the Karuk, the Bear River Band, and the Trinidad Rancheria. We've done energy planning for the County of Humboldt. We actually did the initial Repower Humboldt plan that now has become, it's been adapted by RCEA, but now you know, their planning process is called Repower Humboldt, and we sort of started off together in a project before the CCA was even started with a plan for renewable energy development in Humboldt County. And then we've also done transportation planning. So for EV charging infrastructure, this was also a partnership with RCEA, led to their EV charging infrastructure. That's, you know, there's over a dozen chargers throughout the county and continuing to grow. And we're doing some work these days also on electric and hydrogen buses. We've been doing some work with HTA, looking at electric buses. I mentioned offshore wind, and the microgrid slide is the last slide I have. So next slide, please. Actually, 2 more slides. So this one here features projects that we've fairly recently done. Actually, one's completed. So two microgrids. And Humboldt County has become somewhat famous, I think, for their microgrid projects, and will continue to happen as I talk about the last one. But the first two, the first one is the one that you see on the right-hand side there. That was at the Blue Lake Rancheria. Was the biggest solar array at the time in Humboldt County when that went in. As well as a large Tesla battery bank. It was a tremendous project, got us a lot of attention, funding from the California Energy Commission, but also a lot of match funding from our partners at the Blue Lake Rancheria. has been a great success. It's been in operation, I think, for about 3 years now, and Jana might have more to say about that. And then we also just more recently, and this one's just up and running now, the one to the left is a smaller microgrid for their gas station convenience store. Next slide, please. So this is our the last project I'll talk about is the project Richard mentioned. So this is a project with the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, and one of their projects to develop local resources. So this is at the Humboldt County Airport up in McKinleyville, and it will feature about 2.5 megawatts of PV. So you see the very large PV array there, and a little over 2 megawatts of battery storage, Tesla batteries. And this will be the first front of the meter multi-customer microgrid on PG&E's system. And that's really a big deal. There's a lot of interest. It's something that people statewide are very interested in. I'll be presenting in a CPUC workshop in about a week or so about the project. And yeah, it's a really exciting project. We're cutting some new ground with regard to technology and regulatory process and ownership models. And I think, you know, as an RCEA customer, if those of you participating tonight are RCEA customers, you can be very proud of the RCEA. Their partnership with us and with PG&E is a really unique thing for a CCA to be partnered with a utility on a project like this. And I think they're really, you know, we're really cutting some new ground that hopefully others can follow on. PG&E is actually developing a community microgrid enablement program that will allow other communities with critical facilities. It's focused on critical facilities where they want to do a front of the meter multi-customer microgrid, that the work being done on this project has basically been turned into a program that will be offered for other communities. So that's what I've got tonight, and look forward to the discussion and questions following.
Thank you, Jim. All right, and moving on to Jana.
Lovely. It's great to join you all tonight. Next slide, please. So my work with the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe and the leadership of the tribal government itself, sorry, next slide, if you don't mind. Perfect. You know, in that work, definitely with the partnerships that we have locally that I'll talk about in a second that Jim mentioned, we've improved energy and other forms of resilience because of government leadership, because of our expert partners, and because we've centered the climate crisis in the strategy. And so I just want to take a minute, because I don't think we can talk about resilience on the North Coast without taking a moment to talk about the climate crisis. So I'll be brief, but I think it's important to go over it. The recent impacts we're seeing, wildfires, wildfire smoke inundations, power outages, even pandemics to some degree, other social and economic disruptions, these have been amplified by the warming of our climate. And the numbers are obviously staggering. This year we saw the highest ever ocean temperatures. It was 130 degrees in Death Valley. It was 121 degrees in Los Angeles. We've had extended drought, really volatile weather, and the causes, which are mostly emissions from our energy and transportation sectors, are going the wrong way. They're increasing. So these conditions and their impacts are resulting in loss and socioeconomic disruptions on a very large scale globally, but also locally. So we need to clean up our act, even as we deal with the impacts that are already here. Next slide, please. So locally, the warming climate is making issues that are typical here worse and creating new issues that we haven't experienced before. One new issue is, of course, those public safety power shutoffs. Now, the Humboldt Island is now holding up. It's a part of the PG&E's electrical grid, is now staying energized in our region due to re-engineering and redesign by PG&E and anchored by the natural gas power plant in Eureka. And we have local leadership, including RCEA, to thank for that. But it's just a first step. The PG&E plant with that pesky nuclear waste repository next to it is vulnerable. It's served by one 10-inch natural gas pipeline that runs through earthquake country. It sits on the water's edge directly across from the bay entrance, and so tsunamis are a concern. Local experts have studied the site and projected inundation from groundwater and or sea level rise over the next several decades, which seems like a long way off, but it really isn't when we're talking about redesigning energy infrastructure. So we need a plan to redesign or relocate about 170 megawatts of power here. And we likely need to add some power, even with our great energy efficiency strategies, for electrified transportation and electrified buildings. Next slide, please. So as Jim mentioned, part of the solution is microgrids. The tribe has 3 of them, 2 in operation and 1 in design. They can operate connected to PG&E, the larger grid, or they can disconnect and run under their own power, which is a mix of solar, battery storage, and diesel generators. They've certainly worked to keep the power on and enable critical facilities and infrastructure to continue operations, supporting these lifeline sectors that you see here. They've also reduced emissions and helped create jobs, among other benefits. So we really like them. However, these are pilot projects, and they were built on purpose to inform distributed energy strategy more broadly. And we've learned a lot by building them. They're pretty complicated and expensive to construct. They require the operational scope of running any electrical grid. The tribe is fortunate, so fortunate, to have a technical team that includes the engineers, including Jim Zoellick of the Schatz Energy Research Center, Mark Marshall, Dave Carter, Kristen Radeski, and others. The Redwood Coast Energy Authority is our partner on some of the electric vehicle charging infrastructure there. PG&E has been a great partner. We work with globally leading technology providers, and we have internal experts at the tribe in electrical systems, facilities, and IT. But in general, that expertise capacity can be slim in our rural environment. Right now, we need more electricians in Humboldt, for example. So as we think about microgrids as a widespread strategy, we have some considerations. Ideally, they'd help us balance the entire grid. Like a couple of weeks ago, when a heat storm hit the entire Western United States at the same time and stressed the entire grid out. We islanded and took the vast majority of our power needs offline to help ease that stress. Microgrids should be able to do that. But safe interconnection and coordination with PG&E's rest of the grid is not that simple. And we all want to avoid bad investments, inappropriate technologies, and increased standardization and lower costs. So as we started to talk about earlier, it's a valid question. Should utilities or community choice aggregators like RCEA be the owners and operators of these microgrids, such as the model with the new airport microgrid being built? These entities have the capacity and the expertise to build these mini grids, and they can make them more cooperative with the larger grid, working with CAISO and others, and they can achieve economies of scale. And since we have to move fast to reduce climate forcing emissions, where is it best to focus? On these more kind of niche microgrids, or on larger grid sections like the Humboldt Island that afford us a larger loop, a larger sandbox or swimming pool in the earlier analogy, to place energy assets within, and therefore maybe more cost effective in the build out. One model could be, as I think we've talked about, where the generation and storage assets are provided by different providers and partners, but the connective tissue, wires, distribution, control of that energy is rolled up into a coordinating entity that in turn works with CAISO and other grid managers. And of course, there's lots of other facets to think about, and there's not enough time, but for this session, particularly the overlap of energy and telecommunications and electrified transportation and how all of that is going to now work together. So we need sort of a running series of these kinds of webinars to think through and talk through these things and figure out what we're going to say yes to here in Humboldt. Next slide, please. And so just a quick screenshot of this. This is for further reading if you want more information on climate resilience or microgrids. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jana. All right, a lot of great resources there. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that we can all look at each other's faces here. And I'm going to talk about some questions. So first question, and this one is for everyone. So I encourage whoever has some thoughts to jump in first. What are the major challenges you see to the electricity grid in Humboldt County and the North Coast?
I can jump in quickly, Mahayla. So I'll give away the secret here that some, not all the questions tonight, I don't think, but some of these questions were pre-fed to us. So we did have a chance to think about them and prepare a little bit ahead of time. So yeah, I wish I could be this prepared on just anything off the cuff, but anyway, had to break that news so I didn't feel like I was being dishonest the whole time here while I'm on this webinar. But so I did think about that question a little bit, and I broke it into two categories, sort of issues on a local scale and issues on a large scale in terms of the grid is concerned. And I'm sure there's many other ways to think about this, but this was a couple of things that I thought of. So on a local scale, as we add more distributed generation to the grid, the grid was not designed for two-way power flow, really. It's designed to have central power stations and then feed that power out to customers, you know, along these high voltage lines that Mahayla, that you showed earlier, and then down to lower voltage and out to the extremes. It wasn't really designed to have generators out at the extremes pushing power back the other way. And so the wires and the infrastructure can only handle so much power being generated out on those ends. And for instance, for the I'm sorry, not the, I'm mixing my project up. For the airport microgrid project, I mentioned the size of the PV and battery storage generation that we're putting in there. We've basically taken up all of what is called the hosting capacity on the end of that circuit now. So if somebody else came along and wanted to put in more distributed generation in that area, there's really no more capacity to absorb that power. You could end up with situations where there's too much power. And kind of the analogy that Mahayla used earlier about the swimming pool, it may not, for an actual swimming pool, if the level varies a little bit, not a big deal, right? The water can go up a little bit as long as it doesn't overflow, and it can go down a little bit as long as it doesn't get too low. For the energy grid, for the electricity grid, it is very critical. I mean, we all know what happens if there's not enough power, right? Basically, the lights start to dim, and then it actually just goes out. Well, the same problem happens if there's too much generation and over generation. Things will collapse. So it has to always exactly match. And if you put a bunch of distributed generation on a system that isn't designed for it, you're going to have problems. So microgrids and actually the discussion that John was saying earlier, it'd be interesting to hear some of his input on this. But you know, virtual power plants, basically ways of so adding storage and adding more sophisticated controls. So when you just put a rooftop system in, it just puts out power, and it doesn't really listen to or talk to or interact much with the rest of the system. It just puts out when it can, and that's what it does. There's different ways, sometimes directly communicating to the system, but sometimes more passive ways of changing even the frequency on the system to get the system to respond to those changes. And so there's ways to use the centralized system, accommodate more distributed power coming in, and basically, kind of get everything to play nice together. It's sort of the smart grid of the future, if you will. So there's those changes I think in Humboldt County of allowing, accommodating more distributed generation on our distribution circuits. And as we have load growth with EV charging and that sort of thing, that might be another challenge. Is now there's too much load on a circuit, and you have to accommodate that as well. And storage again could help with that. And then on the large scale side, if we are to pursue projects like the offshore wind project, or category of projects, it's not necessarily one project, there's enough offshore wind off of our coast for gigawatts of electricity. Those lines that Mahayla showed earlier, the transmission lines coming from Reading, which is the main transmission connection for Humboldt County, is about 70 megawatts of power. That's less than half of our average load here in Humboldt County. So if we wanted to develop gigawatts of offshore wind, we need huge increases in transmission capacity to be able to get that power out of this area and to the population centers like the San Francisco Bay Area. So those are sort of two places where I see kind of localized capacity constraints on the system, and then a larger scale if we wanted to develop large scale renewables here and be able to export the power.
Dawn, I wonder if you might speak to some of the things that Jim was bringing up there with the virtual power plants.
Yeah. I mean, it's there's an important message in there, because I know virtual power plants are not an intuitive thing in the sense that we know how they work and how they create value. It's more of a virtual power plant, in essence, is a collaborative effort between utilities and consumers to deploy these clean technologies in the right way, in a way that not only provides the customers with the bill savings value that they're used to seeing associated with these systems, but also in the context of, for example, making sure that we're and so we have projects in other places that have saturated circuits, saturated feeders, like Jim described for the Blue Lake project. And what we can do with these systems is, in consideration of the consumers that are at those locations, we can take a variety of different approaches with what we offer to that consumer. And in collaboration with the utility, understand those areas where there may be capacity constraints or capacity needs. For example, where we're using our resources in, or we're planning to use our resources in New York right now in a project with Con Edison to deploy distributed energy resources at homes and businesses in order to defer investment upgrade costs to upgrade the distribution grid feeder in a particularly congested area. And so the nature of virtual power plants is really about the collaboration of understanding where some of these pain points are for a particular utility, and those pain points tend to equate to cost and or opportunity for value. And then aligning that with the opportunities that present themselves for consumers with the nature of installing battery storage, right, which has a variety of values, the what's called the value stack, because it is a multiple tiered value proposition, including things like backup, reliability during power supply shutoff events, providing bill savings, lowering the longer term cost of electricity for that consumer, for increasing the generation of renewable resources in a particular area for greenhouse gas emission reductions associated with solar, and shifting that energy to later in the day when solar stops producing. And so and on top of that, there are a variety of other technologies that can kind of participate in that whole virtual market, virtual power plant concept, including the future of vehicle to grid with EVs, looking at that on a commercial side, and even to the point where you can think about even the larger picture, which includes front of the meter systems, that there's this opportunity to provide value to both consumers and utilities and the community through the thoughtful design of one of these programs that, whose real goal is to encourage adoption of these technologies to solve for issues that the utilities and the grid experiences as we transition towards that energy economy. It is not uncomplicated.
Absolutely. All right. Let's see, I think I'll transition over to a question. This one's directed at Richard, but certainly anybody else who has thoughts can jump in as well. So Richard, would you please explain what changed with the Humboldt Bay generating station between the last public safety power shutoff season and this one? So basically, you know, from a year ago and now. And why are some parts of Humboldt County still not being able to island?
Thanks, Mahayla. I'm not really privy to lots of detail on this. It wasn't something I was directly involved in. Basically, it sounds like PG&E enabled some features that were intended to be part of the original Humboldt Bay generating station when it was repowered back over a decade ago with the current configuration. Islanding, you know, entails having a grid forming facility or element. And so I think what had happened, for whatever reason we don't really know, was when last year's events hit, the public safety power shutoffs, PG&E didn't really have that all queued up and ready to go, and they had to go back and do some remedial work. Being grid forming means basically that I kind of like an analogy that Kevin Fingerman used in a public workshop to describe this a while ago. Kevin's an environmental science professor at Humboldt State, and he described it as the grid forming element is sort of the DJ at the dance party, you know, that's setting the rhythm. And so, you know, normally, you know, you've got the rhythm of, you know, the 60 hertz, the 60 cycles per second that the grid operates at, that's being, you know, established somewhere else outside of Humboldt County by PG&E, and local generators, whether it's the biomass plants or the Humboldt Bay generating station that's powered by natural gas, or even home renewable energy systems that are connected to the grid through inverters, all have to basically obey the 60 hertz signal that's coming from the central grid. And the change that happened is that now, you know, when Humboldt's grid is isolated from the rest of the grid during a public safety power shutoff, that the Humboldt Bay generating station can act as that DJ that's, you know, deciding how many beats per second, basically, and setting that rhythm. As far as the areas of the county that are not being powered, the plant actually has plenty of capacity. It's, you know, 160 megawatt plant, so it has plenty of generating capacity to support the Humboldt County's loads even at peak. The issue was more about getting back to the fire safety issue, that there's some parts of eastern Humboldt around Hoopa and Willow Creek that are in some of the highest fire hazard areas of the county. And PG&E just, you know, didn't want to kind of defeat the purpose of the public safety power shutoffs by running transmission lines into those higher hazard areas. So they've decided that a safer solution for keeping those areas powered is having, you know, they're calling them microgrids, but really these are, you know, diesel generators that are co-located with existing substations in Hoopa and Willow Creek, and are able to be deployed to keep those substations powered up, and the distribution circuits that are fed by those substations during one of these public safety power shutoff events. There may still be some pockets of the county that are not being served by any of those mechanisms, so that's still an unsolved problem, and I don't know exactly how many customers that would be, but I know that we did see, you know, several hundred to as many as a few thousand Humboldt County customers lose power during this season's PSPS events so far. So you know, we're not completely out of the woods on the PSPS, but the Humboldt Bay generating station getting reconfigured since last year is a huge step forward for Humboldt.
All right, staying on the
Mahayla,
microgrid.
well,
Yeah.
I was just gonna, I was just gonna add one thing, which I think is kind of interesting to me anyway, as an energy nerd. So hopefully the other folks on the, if this is an energy webinar, so I'm assuming everybody on here is a little bit energy nerdy. But so what Richard just described for Humboldt County and the ability of the Humboldt Bay Generating Station to island and essentially, to become a grid forming generator and establish the frequency and keep Humboldt powered when it's disconnected from the larger electric grid, which normally sets the, forms the grid as Richard described it. That's exactly what happens on these microgrids. So the 2 microgrids we talked about, and the third one that the Blue Lake Rancheria is in the process of designing, and the microgrid that we're working on right now at the airport. They're set up so that when the grid goes down, the power goes out, they just disconnect from the main grid, and then the generation in the microgrid, you have to have a grid forming generator. And so, and actually in your microgrid, you can have multiple generators, but you have one grid forming generator. So for the airport, for instance, there's a large system, the battery system, and often if it's with PV, you need a battery because the battery has got, stored energy and it's stable. So it can kind of set the frequency and it can charge or discharge if it needs to, and the PV just kind of follows along. But at the airport system, there will be a PV and battery system that will be the grid forming generator. There's a separate PV system. It actually looks like one big array, but there's a separate part of that array that is being interconnected as a net metered array behind a retail meter. So it's essentially like a rooftop solar system. I have a 1 kilowatt system on my roof. This one's going to be 300 kilowatts, but it's really interconnected to the grid just like the system on my roof. It doesn't have any battery storage. It doesn't have the ability to control its output. It just puts out power when it can. When that system is islanded, the bigger battery and PV system will be the grid forming generator, and the smaller PV system will still be able to be interconnected, and it will follow the grid forming signal of that larger generator. And you could start having, so one of the things that we're actually exploring as potential future sort of project material here on the North Coast is for a project like the airport microgrid, that could potentially be expanded, and you could have a situation where, and it might even be a case where you have too much solar generation. You could disconnect from the larger grid, and you might have multiple generators, but you'd have one grid forming generator on that microgrid that forms the grid, and the other generators just follow. And actually that grid forming generator can raise its frequency a little bit if there's too much generation from the other generators. When it raises its frequency, the other generators will see that and will decrease. And every system that goes in nowadays has to have what's called a smart inverter. And the smart inverter has basically that feature. It says, if the frequency starts to go up, I'm going to start to reduce my output. And it doesn't need any other kind of communication. So there are some interesting ways to, to start to try to get things to play nice on the grid. But I just thought it was an interesting parallel that what's now being done with Humboldt County as a whole in terms of turning the Humboldt Bay Generating Station into a grid, allowing it to be a grid forming generator. And then other generators, you could have the biomass plant or other solar plants or whatever still on the grid in Humboldt, and then they're following that grid forming generator. The same thing is being done at these smaller microgrids like the airport or the Blue Lake Rancheria.
Mm-hmm. So let's see, from the larger scale, let's go down to kind of the personal level. So this is primarily directed at John and Richard, but of course anybody jump in as they have thoughts. But the question is, what can the average person do to maintain their energy security?
Why don't I jump in, and then, at least I can express the side of the business that I'm working on. Which is my experience and with the marketplace is much broader than just selling batteries and storage. So I think the first answer is always, be energy efficient in your use. Make sure that you are efficiently using your energy because everything we do on top of when we're looking at installing solar or installing batteries, when we're trying to figure out how much of your energy we can put on backup during an outage, the first step is energy efficiency, and the best greenhouse gas reduction is the ton that you never use, and so I think just at first glance that's super important. The second piece is working with your utility to figure out what types of supportive programs there are. These mechanisms by which folks can explore different technologies or different solutions and how they fit within their utility bill is important, because a lot of this stuff is pretty complicated, and utilities, I think, do a good job of being a repository and a warehouse for information about these various technologies, solar and storage. It gets pretty complicated quickly when as a homeowner, trying to figure out what the right system size for a solar project is. I mean, my mom's a mechanical engineer, and she always asks me. She's been putting solar and exploring battery storage on her home, and even she will bring me, some information. I'll be like, no, I think, your system's probably a little larger than it needs to be, or here's the reality of how this configuration is likely to work. And so even for us energy geeks, this stuff gets complicated quickly, and so it's important to have a good a guide, or a chaperone, so to speak, when you're looking at this information, to try to give you what's already been distilled and is specific to your utility grid, your utility usage, things like that. So rely on those programs that exist within those utilities to explore those options more broadly.
I want to thank John for putting the emphasis on efficiency and conservation there. We've framed RCEA in this evening's discussion as a community choice aggregator, and that is exactly what we've been, among other things, since 2017. But actually, RCEA has been around since 2003 and was originally set up mainly to provide energy efficiency and energy management services to Humboldt County. And I think, we really have that deeply embedded in our DNA as an organization. And I do too, personally. I spent years working in energy efficiency before I got involved in the energy R&D stuff that I did when I was a Schatz employee, and more recently, the more supply side stuff I'm doing now. I think when I think about energy security and resiliency, I want to give a shout out to the thousands of Humboldt County residents who have been living resiliently since long before that term became a buzzword. I mean, to really go back, our local tribes, of course, lived without the grid for millennia and had a high quality of life. And we should always remember that life is possible without a grid at all. But then there were the back to the landers that really started settling in the hills of Humboldt in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they were the first users of home scale off-grid electric power systems back before we even had grid interconnection and net metering as an option. I don't have data to back this up, but I heard it said a lot back in the 90s that Humboldt County probably had more per capita off-grid renewable energy systems than anywhere else, probably in the United States. There's a lot of kind of interesting kind of socioeconomic history and technology history behind that, and entrepreneurship of people like David Katz, who are just out there, making a wonderful business opportunity out of that. Somebody needs to write a book on that someday if it hasn't already been done. At our house, earlier this year, before the COVID-19 hit and changed things, my wife and I hosted an old friend who's spent the last 30 years or so living out in the hills of Humboldt off grid. And it was a real eye opener when she came to stay with us. My wife and I are pretty energy frugal, but this friend of ours who came to stay with us, has just been living off grid for most of her adult life. And, it was just amazing to, share our home with somebody who does not take a single watt hour for granted, and her lifestyle really reflected that. And, we had her staying in our house for 2 or 3 months, and our electricity bill didn't go up the slightest bit that I could even detect. So I think, there's a lot of individual lifestyle choices we can make that have a lot to do with our energy security and resiliency.
Yeah, I just want to chime in on that because I think it's a multi-pronged approach at the individual level. As Richard was saying, and John and Jim, conservation is central. Energy efficiency. California has some of the highest per kilowatt hour energy costs, but some of the lowest household bills. And it's because of good energy policy and deployment through programs like RCEA of energy efficiency measures. And I make this point when I travel to speak in other forums, because as we think about where we go going forward, one of the things that was really an eye-opener for me was I had the opportunity to be a part of the long-range planning committee for the Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District. And we, this was many years ago now, maybe even almost 10 years ago now. And it was a 2-year process to think about water use and conservation and how we were going to use water for industry. And the pulp mills had closed, and so there was some part of the water permit that was technically unused, and those kinds of issues were going on. And water is a core utility just like energy. And I really thought that the community was going to be pretty sensitive to cost. But what we found in a number of community meetings, I don't recall how many exactly, but I would say there were probably like close to a dozen community meetings throughout the lifespan of this 2-year planning process. Cost of water was actually low priority. The priority was environmental stewardship and local control and resilience of that water supply. And I think what we've heard in some of the energy planning forums from individual people is that those priorities exist in the energy space as well. And so when we think about what we can do as individuals, we need to remember a couple things at the same time. One is that the climate crisis is here, and it's causing a lot of these issues that we're dealing with right now, or at least amplifying them in ways that are out of control. We know how to fix it. We need to reduce our emissions from the energy and transportation sector and other sectors, but those are the 2 largest. And we need to, each one of us, figure out how to do our part in that, both in individual ways like conservation, but also in engagement in these community decisions around how we're going to structure our energy and transportation sector. Things like offshore wind, things like decarbonization and backing out natural gas, things like making sure that all the energy resources we do build have carbon life cycle accounting, so we know how these things are impacting the climate. And we need to learn more about the health externalities in the immediate term of every single piece of our energy sector. And those are the things that are nerdy. They're complicated in many ways, but we can't forget that 70% of the climate emissions are caused by 100 companies across the globe. And many of those companies are in the energy and transportation sectors. And so in addition to conservation, things like making your views known to your elected officials at the local, state, and national level. What do you want your environment to look like? And each person is going to come at these things in their own way. But if we achieve resilience without greenhouse gas reductions, we are chasing an ever moving target that's moving away from us, because without reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we're making the core problem worse. So I know that's a lot to think about, but as I think about actions on an individual level, yes, it's conservation, it's reducing energy use, but it's also advocating for the kind of community and the kind of infrastructure that we do want, ideally. And once we have a plan for that, it will absolutely happen.
I'm going to jump in here with a question from an audience member. So I've been corresponding with someone over the Q&A who is from a small wastewater treatment facility here in Humboldt. And I'm wondering, John, if you can speak to how Swell might use the battery storage systems as part of the virtual power plant that you were talking about during periods of normal grid operation, normal grid stability, blue sky conditions as they're otherwise referred to, and then how that might change during a grid outage or a shut-off event.
Sure. I'll use the pool analogy again, which is great. Thank you for that. And kind of related also to this localness, I would say. So virtual power plants are really intended to be comprised of systems installed locally, right? So we're not pulling power in from out of area. We're generating power in area, and the backup, the resiliency that these resources provide, it is site specific, it's customer specific, and there's a conversation that happens when we're working with a customer to figure out what the right system size is, to figure out what the right amount of reliability is that they want and that we can provide. And that's their conversations around defining, for example, particular circuits at your home or business where maybe we'll feed the refrigerator, so the refrigerator won't go out, you won't lose your food, or there'll be an outlet to charge, all the way up to providing backup for the whole site or premise. And so as a normal course of operating, these systems by default are designed to attempt to maximize the customer benefits associated with maximizing on-site consumption of solar, and that means charging from any solar that would be extra to your load, in excess of your load, stuff that would otherwise be exporting to the grid, right? Which we already know, in large volumes, the grid doesn't like to see a lot of that backflow of power. So using batteries to make sure that the grid stability is maintained by soaking up that excess solar and then discharging it to later in the evening, which consequently tends to overlap with higher priced energy periods under time of use rates. And so just as a default baseline, the battery as a technology, as it relates to residential consumers, is really about maximizing or optimizing the shifting of that solar energy to later in the day, and being prepared to provide backup when it's called upon. And the when it's called upon is important, right? There are weather events that are not associated with a power supply shutoff, but there are also these new power supply shutoff events. And in either case, our systems are designed to take those potentialities into consideration, and instead of operating under a virtual power plant scenario where we're supplying power to the grid, if we're preparing for outages above and beyond the trying to make sure that there's enough capacity to run the grid, if we think that there's going to be an outage, then the system is sort of prepares itself ahead of time. It looks forward and says, look, I want to make sure that the battery is fully charged for this upcoming or impending event. And so I'm basically checking out of participating in the larger pool of wholesale market resources for this temporary time frame. And to give a sense of the scale that we're talking about, right? So for we've heard 70 megawatts, 140 megawatts. And in the near term, these virtual power plants are on a tenth of that scale. You know, maybe 5 megawatts, maybe 10 megawatts, because there are a lot of externalities that kind of, in terms of cost and customer value and what we can offer them, that inherently limit the market to a certain degree, and is also what these incentives reduce those challenges a little bit for consumers. But during times when when we're actually operating the VPP in service to the utility, the evaluation is basically providing power more or less during the tail end of that duck curve that we saw as one of the first slides. So from between 4 to 9 p.m., which is the typical high peak period in California, that our resources are available and capable of providing a forecasted amount of resource to the utilities. And I'm not going to get into the complicated nature of a California ISO tariff on this call, but suffice to say that when we're operating the VPP in concert with the other priorities of maximizing a customer's bill savings, maintaining a portion of that battery storage for reliability, or combining solar to reinforce the reliability portion of the battery by allowing that battery to be charged from solar during outages, that the operation of the VPP is complementary to the customer value offer. That means that, for example, if we need to not discharge your battery during those late peak day time frames because we need to have that system available to participate in a virtual power plant, that customers are compensated through these programs, through an incentive or some kind of rewards program, in lieu of, you know, necessarily a portion of their annual bill savings that they would have otherwise received by just the default dumping the energy in during that peak period, right? And so there are nuances in here, but the main idea is the system and design and how it's sold to consumers takes into consideration the future operation of that system for a virtual power plant, and also conditionalizes that operation around these outage potentialities, these power supply shutoffs, and taking notice around them, making sure that we reserve. Really, the goal here is to kind of first and foremost reserve that power and provide that value to consumers, because their experience is obviously a huge priority for the site-driven DERs.
All right. Yeah, really interesting. Thanks for that question. Okay, I see that we are closing in on the hour pretty soon here, and I'd like to go with a question. Start with Jana, and then see if anybody else wants to jump in as well. So shifting gears a little bit, how do the grid interruptions that we've seen recently over the summer in particular and into the fall, how do those grid interruptions contribute to inequality? And what are some of the policy changes you'd like to see to address that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we touched on this with some of the early remarks about, like, for example, in the public safety power shutoffs in 2019 and then this year, remote communities like the Hoopa Valley Tribe and others were powered up by emergency diesel generators. Now, diesel generators work, and they're readily available to some degree, and people know how to work on them and fix them. And in an emergency, if someone needs powered medical equipment, like we've seen in these public safety power shutoffs, you know, it would be nice to be able to assume that everybody can live without power and just sort of weather that condition. But the fact of today's world is that we have a lot of things that depend on good, reliable power. These communities that are tribal, rural, or both are usually at the end of the line. Tribes in California, like the Yurok and Hupa, portions of their lands still do not have access to the grid. They've never had power, grid supplied power in those regions. And so from an equity and resilience standpoint, I'd like to see emergency power be provided by something other than diesel generators, because even though the power is welcome, the associated particulate matter pollution and emissions and health impacts from that is not welcome. And tribes are bringing that up in the appropriate forums, and PG&E in fact has started to roll out solar and battery storage skids in place of diesel generators based on input from tribes and other disadvantaged communities. So I think there's work being done. As John mentioned, there is this equity and resiliency budget within the self-generation incentive program from the California Public Utilities Commission. Those monies are in that particular budget are for what they call equity communities. It's basically critical infrastructure, critical facilities in disadvantaged communities. And the incentive is a very good one. It's going to get a lot of battery storage delivered and a lot of energy resilience delivered to those communities. So there is good work being done. SB 350 has a provision in it for a disadvantaged communities advisory group that advises the California Energy Commission and the California Public Utilities Commission on policy. I sit on that committee, and good work is being done there to try to make energy and energy resilience more equitable.
All right, looks like we have just a couple more minutes left, and I want to squeeze every last second out of it. So in the last couple of minutes here, maybe a 30-second version of what everyone is excited about. Now that could be maybe a technology that you're looking towards, a policy. I leave it fairly open, but since I have to pick on someone here, I will go ahead and pick on my own supervisor. So Richard, what are you excited about?
All right, I'll spit this out real quick. I was just very excited that earlier this year we had a group of graduating senior environmental resources engineering students from Humboldt State University tackle a problem that our public has brought to us many times, which is, okay, if there's biomass power being generated in Humboldt County, and one of the main justifications for that is this material that's coming out of the forest products industry that's basically a waste material that needs to be disposed of. What other alternatives are there other than burning that stuff in power plants? And so we set a whole class of engineering students to work on that problem, and they came up with a fascinating set of possible solutions and some in-depth analysis on those solutions. And that got our community advisory committee so excited that they've launched a new subcommittee that's going to focus on that issue, make recommendations to our board of directors on how RCEA might play a role in moving some of those alternative ideas forward, some of which are energy ideas that RCEA could be deeply involved in. Some of them are non-energy products, which might mean handing the idea off to some other appropriate party. But anyway, just a very exciting pathway to be on, and I'm thrilled about that.
Great. John, your 20-second version.
Yeah, I'm well, one, I'm excited to be working with RCEA to bring a new virtual power plant. I think this has been, although 2020 has been challenging for a number of reasons, virtual power plants over the last couple of years have really started to take hold in a lot of markets where utilities are looking to pool up these resources. And I think it's because it's to date been either an oppositional or an untapped resource to work directly with consumers to support adoption of these technologies in the way that we're going about it. And so I'm really excited about really getting into the market and providing the opportunity for folks to get these technologies in Humboldt County, disadvantaged folks who are going to qualify for the ER. I guess I just really enjoy what I do, and I like seeing more solar and battery storage installed out in the marketplaces. So I'm gung ho about the program that we're putting together.
Oh, great. Jim, what are you excited about?
Well, I'm excited about partnerships is one thing I'm excited about. And I think we do a great job here on the North Coast of fostering partnerships. And I'm excited about distributed generation and includes things like demand response and includes electric vehicle charging and so forth. I'm excited about what I see as the possibilities for integrating those with the larger grid in a way that they, rather than creating problems, they provide support. And I think one of the things that I think is important for people to realize is I don't think the answer, this is me personally, I don't think the answer is each of us trying to have our own little solar system and a battery and like now I'm self-sufficient and I don't have to worry about it and no one else has to worry about me. I think basically having that distributed energy is important, but I think the centralized grid is also important, and I think they can exist together and support each other, and that's where I'd like to see things headed.
Mm-hmm. Jana, what are you excited about?
I'm excited to see if Humboldt County could become the first deeply carbon negative county in the United States, and build on its legacy and foundations of energy innovation to really move the needle on the climate crisis in the way that it needs to be moved. And I'm excited about offshore wind and the first pass of the research that gets us deeply knowledgeable about how that kind of an industry could benefit and need to be mitigated here on the North Coast. And I just really want to thank you all for a great discussion tonight. I really appreciate it.
All right. Hey, that was my line. Thank you to the audience for participating and our community for being engaged in this subject. And thank you so much to our panel of experts. We so appreciate your knowledgeable, your sharing of knowledge for all of us. All right, and now I will release everyone to go and have dinner. Have a good night,
everyone.
folks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.